I'm so glad to be with you again. It's good to be able to talk with you, whether it's some passing thought of the day or a scripture that's impressed upon me. I always look forward to these visits. I'm thinking this day of a passage that was such a favorite of mine when I was a boy in high school. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. I came to feel, I guess, some kind of teenage pride that made me take hold of that verse because I was active in a great many things in high school and had a certain amount of position and responsibility that I thought was terribly important at the time. But at the same time, my whole life was given to the idea that I was called to preach, and I was doing everything I could in the church. And on an occasion, therefore, or two, I found myself preaching on the street corner in my hometown, a town of 79 or 80,000 people. And I was sure that somewhere in the course of my preaching, I would see some of my high school friends walking by. And I said to myself, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. I will be proud to be identified here on the street corner, declaring the faith. I pondered it often since then. We're passing through a variety of phases, I think, in American life. Not many of us here entertain much thought of flat-out, harsh persecution. We read of what's happening in some countries of the world, in the Sudan, for example, and other countries not to be named. We say to ourselves, those people, if they're not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, if they let their position be known, it takes great courage for them to do so. And our life here is a pretty modest one by any kind of comparison. We know the gospel as something that can be proclaimed on essentially any place in the country, with churches and buildings and institutions that show so much of the prominence of Christianity in our country. At the same time, I ponder frequently these days what I see as a kind of rising criticism, a critiquing, a harshness often in a certain level of the media and a certain level of the intellectual life of our nation. I'm thinking of a phrase that a German theologian more than a century ago, Friedrich Schleiermacher, used often to describe his day. He spoke about those cultured despisers of Christianity. And he knew something about it, of course, in Germany in that era, because at that time, certainly there was an intellectual ferment that put down Christianity. There is something of that mood at a certain intellectual level in America these days. We don't feel it in the ordinary run of life. We don't see it that much in ordinary daily newspapers or media. But I suspect that more and more, at one level, it is asserting itself, and it is seeping down then into other levels of life, so that, for example, we see some pretty brash and irresponsible things said and done on television, and it will be, I think, increasingly so. Well, what is our answer to that? We can start fighting back and declaring all kinds of strong statements. We can insist that radio and television and newspapers not give credence to that kind of talk. But that's not a very effective answer. I think the effective answer is to believe, as the Apostle Paul did, that he had something very, very special operating in his life, and that specialness made it matter more than anything anybody could say. Listen to how he put it. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, because it is the power of God unto salvation. I think if you and I know that, if we have felt that power of God saving in our lives, if we have seen it operative in other people's lives, if we know the miracle that comes when the power of the cross moves into a person's life, then indeed we have nothing to be ashamed of. And what we have, we don't really have to fight about or make snide remarks about what the opposition would say. We simply have to know what Christ has done for us, and quite gladly, not abrasively, quite gladly declare the good thing we know, and let the integrity and the power and the reality of this gospel take care of the rest. That's what I'm thinking about today, and I'm glad to be able to pass it along to you. God bless until we can be together again.